I'm Amy Pruitt.
I'm Lisa Dumas.
I teach Ayurveda and yoga.
I teach yoga. I'm a yoga therapist in training, and I offer transformational coaching. But that's just part of the story.
We're moms, daughters, wives, and friends. We're always learning, and we've both experienced healing by what we teach.
And the intention of this podcast is to offer you our favorite tools from the traditions and sciences that support us as we navigate the realities and stressors of modern life.
Each week, we'll share stories, answer your questions, and talk to others who inspire us.
Welcome to the Radiant Warrior Podcast.
Yoga and Ayurveda to reclaim a courageous heart.
We are so excited to welcome a very powerful and inspiring woman onto our show. She's a former professional snowboarder. She's an entrepreneur. She's a world traveler. She's a fabulous yoga teacher. She's a natural leader. And now she helps other yoga teachers and leaders build their businesses. She has so much to say about speaking your truth. She did so in a very popular TEDx talk. She has a lot to say about resilience and how to protect yourself from burnout. This is Must Listen Podcasting. Welcome to the show, Katie Brauer.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
You and I have met before. I was living in San Diego and I was a newly minted Anusara yoga teacher. And I visited a beautiful, sweet yoga studio in Del Mar, still one of my favorite places to practice. And that was a yoga studio that you owned. And you taught a lovely class. And then after class, I had shared with you that I was a new teacher, and you offered me the opportunity to perhaps sub at that studio. And I was so excited. I think we remember first becoming a teacher and we're nervous about the whole thing. But I never did reach out or come back because I did struggle with fear. And I was really struggling with self-doubt in those days. It took me a long time to step into feeling worthy enough to teach these practices. It wasn't really until I learned to teach through my own lens and, share how yoga really helped me with anxiety. So that's just what I wanted to share off the top here is you never heard from me again because I was too scared.
Wow. I'm so sad because
I know.
Gosh, I feel like that's just, it's so valuable that your willingness and your courageousness to share that because in sharing, like the first thing that comes to mind and heart for me is like, oh, wait, what? That was a missed opportunity for me to show up for you and to meet you where you were in the fear and the self-doubt and really support you in that. And I think that for all of us, when we shut down, it not only costs us, but it takes away the opportunity for others to meet us where we're at. I'm glad we're here now.
Oh, believe me, I am making up for lost time now. And in those days, you probably wouldn't have been able to tell. I did a pretty good job of wearing a cloak of confidence, but it's been my journey over the past decade to cultivate that real authentic courage. And it comes from being able to, speak some of these truths that I would have been ashamed of. I would have been ashamed to be too afraid to step up. But that was just the truth of it. So thanks for holding space for me and hearing it through your lens. Amy and I are both very inspired by you. Yours is a story of such resilience, challenges, and rising. And now you're really inspiring others with what you've learned along the way. So we want to catch our listeners up with your story, starting with your childhood. What was it about the environment at home that spawned such a competitive spirit in you and your siblings? As we mentioned in the beginning, you were a professional snowboarder, sister a World Cup skier, brother an Olympian. What was that like at home?
It's really, what's interesting is neither our mom or dad was like pushy with sports at all. I think all three of us just inherited a very driven, like naturally driven nature and very active and were exposed to lots of different sports right from the get-go. It was very much a lifestyle. My parents were very supportive of whatever endeavor we wanted to follow. They really followed our lead, but both my mom and my dad are incredible. My dad's passed now, but both incredible sports people and very athletic. So we all sort of inherited those athletic genes along with the drive.
So, Katie, you're open in your bio about being expelled from 3 high schools. And we talk a lot about teenage wounds and how they can follow us around as adults. Can you tell us what you were looking for at that time?
Yeah, sure. I would say that this is sort of where the sports piece came in, was that became a really healthy vice for me to channel a lot of confusion from my childhood. My parents got divorced when I was 6, and there was a lot behind the scenes that my mom sort of, I guess, became aware of with my dad's behavior and whatnot. And none of that was actually shared with us kids. My mom didn't share like the truth of really what happened until I was in my early 20s. And I was like, whoa, what? And so there was really a huge lack of conversation that happened in the family about what was going on. And, there was all these changes happening, and we as kids really weren't included in any of the decision making or anything. And that was really confusing, because as a child, which is the same thing that we do as adults, when we're trying to understand, there's meaning making and stories and all of these things that are happening in the gaps to try to understand. And as a kid, sort of the story that I made up and the meaning that I gave my parents' divorce was, oh, well, maybe it was me. Maybe I'm not good enough. And that's really where my sort of performance-based perfectionism came from, and a lot of the undercurrent of the drive. Like, I naturally and inherently have a lot of drive, but then it was sort of kicked into high level with these wounds. And the way in which that played out in a really unhealthy way was, I got into all sorts of mischief, and I've always been a leader. So that means that I got my friends into all kinds of mischief. Like, I was the kid that the parents were like, oh no, they're friends with Katie Brauer, influential on the shadow side as well when I was a younger kid. And I was just, honestly, I was searching for attention. I was really desperately wanting to feel acknowledged and seen by both of my parents, and they were kind of dealing with their own thing, and the way in which they communicated and expressed love was just in a way that didn't that I wasn't able to receive. Like, it wasn't my language. And so that played out in, I got into drugs, and I just was a complete troublemaker. I mean, I would, during exam week, put in a phone call to the fire station about planting a bomb so that the whole school shut down. Not just little stuff. It was like big, terrible things that I did as a kid. Very extreme.
All we ever really want is love, right? And if we look down to the root of our actions, especially when we look at our teenager and our inner teenager, we can see that, we're all just calling out for something. Mm-hmm. But something that stood out when you were sharing that story is that you weren't told the truth when you were growing up. And I don't want to jump into the TED Talk yet because I want to stick with the timeline. But when I watched your TEDx talk, I expected your talk to be about resilience and your snowboarding career and how you've literally and figuratively gotten back up after falling down so many times. Yet it was about this radical truth telling. Do you think that you're so interested in the truth because you felt it was concealed from you then?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because TEDx wanted me to talk about all of the things that you you just said. They were like, no, we don't want you to talk about this. Yeah, I do, because when sort of everything was revealed to me, there was this deep validation And I've found this to be true in many aspects and times throughout my life, whether it's been with a friend that shares something that is heavy on their heart, that has been bothering them, that I've felt something's off. And so I have clued into, and I've sort of gone tap, 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 like, what's up? What's going on? Something doesn't feel right. And then they've had that courageousness to step into the truth in the same way that my mom did. And it just, the feeling of being in truth is something that I just won't ever compromise, because that's where freedom is for me, is just in being totally aligned with what's true for me, and really being a truth teller and being honest with myself as well. And that was something all the way up until my dad's death. At the very, very end, his entire life, he avoided taking ownership for what really happened, and there was blame and a lack of responsibility. And then at the very end, he indicated that he realized he'd really messed up, and that was one of his biggest regrets. And that, I think, was a validation for my mom. In the same way that when she shared the truth with me, it was a validation for me of, oh, that makes sense. Now I need to reorganize all of the things that I have thought, and all of those in the spaciousness where there was gaps in the story that I had just made up the story because I didn't know the truth.
It's so interesting, the stories that we tell ourselves about the way things were. And then when we find out the truth, it could be something entirely different.
What I realized when Mum told me the truth about everything, and there was that visceral, like, felt sense and resonance of like, oh, I'm feeling a settling in my system. Okay. Because we can feel the truth when it's shared. Then on the tail end of that was like, well, holy crap. That means that basically everything Dad has told me, which I've believed, is a lie. Now I need to integrate that and have compassion for, my dad was an alcoholic and a gambler. So having compassion for him in his limitations. Our dynamic was very much reversed. Like, I was the parent in the relationship from a very, very, very young age, in my very early teens. And he put a lot of pressure on me of like, you have to help me, you have to save me, it's up to you. And I really took that on as my job and my role. And in my early 20s, I had a conversation with my dad when he called me in the middle of the night. I was at this stage living in America, and he was drunk and, whatever, he'd like gambled a ton of money away, and he was in all this strife, and he was doing the same thing. And I just said, Dad, I love you. And I had a conversation with him the next day when he was sober of like, I love you, and that's never going to change, but you are not my responsibility. My dad and I always had a really beautiful relationship. Like, I don't ever remember having arguments with my dad but it was much healthier after that conversation when I was 22. From the age of 0 to 22, what I thought was real wasn't real. And that the impact of that has definitely affected in my adult years in relationship, particularly in intimate relationship, of the thing that feels familiar is my dad, who was not able to be in the truth, not able to take responsibility. And so that has kind of gotten me in strife, even as someone that's like very conscious. And, I consider myself to be like quite aware, as like now I've gotten more wise to it in the last few years of like, oh, if it feels familiar, it's a big red flag.
So it sounds like maybe your mom was saving the truth for an age appropriate time.
Yeah. And I really, I respect her I wasn't angry at her for withholding that. I really respect the fact that I think where she was coming from was she didn't want to influence the way in which we viewed our father, and really wanted to leave it up to us to make our own judgment. But it definitely would have changed a lot of things for me along the way throughout those teenage years. And, that's where I just sort of rest into the unfolding of life. It's messy, and we're all just learning along the way.
Mm-hmm. I think this speaks to something else that we all have in common, because you took Ashley's Yoga Psyche Soul too,
Yes,
right?
correct.
Yes. And through that, and obviously through different learnings in personal development and Western psychology, we do learn that how we are formed in our childhood homes is how we are in relationships. And so much of that is not our fault. We can't be aware of so much of that. We did what we did in order to be safe. And if we're growing up in a situation that we thought was one way and it's really not, of course, it's going to color our relationships. And the hard part is that our relationships are now our opportunities for healing.
Mm-hmm.
We all know that. And so I'm so glad that you threaded that into this conversation. And I'm also thinking that, so you mentioned that in your childhood home, you really were a leader there too, having more responsibility, taking responsibility for people. And then meanwhile, you are competitive in the snowboarding world. So I'm just trying to think about all the pressure that you must have felt that you were under in those years.
Yeah, it's interesting because it wasn't until I was in my sort of mid-teenage years, and I remember specifically one night I was at a friend's house and her parents were asking me questions. And the response to their questions about kind of our life and where we grew up and all this type of thing, the look on their face alarmed me to the fact that, maybe that's not normal, because when my parents divorced when I was 6, we moved with my mom a couple of hours out of Sydney, and my mom owned restaurants. And so our kind of flow was mom would pick us up from school, drop us at home, dinner would be ready for us to eat whenever we wanted. We didn't have a babysitter, so it was my sister who was 8, I was 6, my brother was 2, and mom went to work. And we, did our homework and ate our food and packed the dishwasher and got ourselves ready for bed and went to bed. And that was just normal. And at a very young age, we were all very independent, obviously, as a result of that. And, now being a mom with a 4-year-old, I'm just like, what? I don't, how? But my life makes so much sense to me now. But that was really where I realized, okay, this is, it's very much shaped me to be like fiercely independent and very capable of doing really anything and everything. And the double-edged sword of that is very difficult for me to ask for help. And because that's the way that I've always done it, I don't really know another way of doing it because I haven't experienced that. Like, particularly in an intimate relationship, like being taken care of. I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? I'm the one that takes care. Like, I'm the one that shows up in all of the ways and financially shows up and takes care of everything, and my partner. So that's unexplored territory for me moving into my future.
Katie, did your siblings experience your childhood the same way that you did?
No, they don't, which is really interesting because there was 2 very pivotal moments during my childhood that were very, I mean, for lack of a better word, I would say traumatic. If my mom happens to listen to this podcast, like, I don't blame you for anything. I love you. The 2 things were when mom and dad divorced and there was really no discussion about anything that was happening. And then the second point was when I was 12, my mom had an opportunity with a restaurant that was quite a ways from where we lived, like 4 or 5 hours from where we lived. And she decided that she was going to do this venture. And again, there was no discussion. It was just, we came home from school one day and there was this woman standing in the dining room. And my mum said, I'm going to go and do this trial for 6 months and see if it works out. And if it does, then you guys will all move down. And if it doesn't, I'll be back. And that was it. It was, this is who's going to be looking after you. And there was no conversation. So those were really the two kind of big things. And I can see very, very clearly, it was actually in my mid-20s, I was in India on one of the trips that I did, and I studied with this incredible woman over there. Her name's Usha. And she explained, I had been exposed to and studied the chakras many times before, but the way that she explained the developmental phases and the way I was able to then map it back against these moments in my life, I was just like, oh, this makes so much sense of why I began to behave in the way that I did. A 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, because that was very, there was a lot of hurt and I was really angry at my mother. And there was no felt sense of inclusion, of being a part of the decision-making process or a communication about why things were happening the way that they were. It was just, that was sort of if you look back throughout the family history, which still continues now, although I would say that I'm the big disruptor, there's very little conversation that happens.
The Radiant Warrior podcast will be right back. This episode is brought to you by A Radiant Year, our monthly program that sends you a class that we create for you every week, offering therapeutic yoga and Ayurveda skills to support you in practicing real self-care.
We design these classes to help you integrate simple and powerful tools into your life to help you move worry and overwhelm and cultivate more contentment and vitality.
Enrollment opens next on December 6th for you to join us for a radiant winter. It's your chance to gather tools to feel more vibrant and at peace during the shorter days and cooler weather. We'll begin on winter solstice.
Learn and grow with us seasonally or yearly. Head to aradiantyear.com to get on the wait list.
Well, it's no surprise why you are so fiercely independent. And you've mentioned one of your journeys to India, but what is also so impressive about you is you have traveled the world and you've gone on so many incredible adventures and you've had so many incredible experiences. But let's go back to when you were still snowboarding. You had a massive amount of injuries that you sustained, and you kept literally falling down, getting back up, and continuing. What made you finally decide to retire? And then what was that like? And where did that lead you? What was your first adventure after that? So a couple questions there.
Yeah. So one thing to note that I think has been really helpful for me throughout my entire life on the injury piece and the kind of falling down, getting back up, was with all of my injuries and really anything challenging that I've gone through, I always really look at, okay, I am going to do everything in my power to minimize the possibility of this happening again, so that if it does happen again, I'm not going to blame myself and sit in thinking, well, I wonder if I didn't do enough. So that goes for relationships that are challenging. That was the same in my marriage. I was like, I am going to do every single thing that I could possibly do that's in my control, so that when I look back, if it gets to the point that it doesn't work out and my marriage didn't work out, and I chose to file for divorce, looking back on that, there's nothing more that I could have done. Like, I've turned over every stone. And I think that that's been very freeing for me. One of the last injuries that I had was a dislocated elbow. And it was, oh man, it was excruciating. I mean, it was the worst one of all of the injuries that I had, particularly when the doctor was trying to relocate it. After that, I was back on snow and I was at a contest and the weather was really, really bad. The light was really low. It was super windy. It was very icy. And I was in a slopestyle contest. And it was the first time that I really was experiencing fear in the way that I was not able to reorient my attention to, the training that I'd done and the confidence that I have in my body. And it was just like the fear just gripped me. And that was the moment that I realized, okay, like I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not having fun. Why am I doing this? Why am I, and I think the answer to that question of why I was doing it and why I kept getting up and, getting myself back on the tour and rehabbing was the drive underneath when I got really honest with myself was, again, this performance-based perfectionism in the hopes that I would experience and receive the love that I so desperately desired in the way that I wanted to receive it from my parents. And after all of those years of pushing and pushing and pushing and really achieving some pretty spectacular things, I sort of just got real with myself and I said, well, why would that happen now? Because it hasn't happened up until this point after all of the things that you have achieved. So, like, do you want to do it anymore? And the answer was no.
So, Katie, it sounds like you went on a journey of the soul following that decision. Can you tell us, when does yoga come to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I was introduced to yoga when I was 19 and really encouraged by my dryland coach to do it as a part of my off-snow training. I'm like, I would say a recovering type A person. And he was like, you're uptight and your body's tight. And I think this yoga stuff could help. And so that was when I got into it. And I would say the perfectionism piece in the very beginning, of course, it was for me all about like mastering all of the poses and like doing all of the crazy arm balances. And it really was just a one-dimensional practice. It was purely physical and it was purely from that standpoint. It wasn't until I was 22 that it, and I would say that things gradually began to shift during that time of 19 to 22, really 20 to 22. But it was at 22 when I had one of the more challenging injuries that I had that was not just physically debilitating, but also emotionally and energetically debilitating, that I really sort of went down the rabbit hole with yoga in search of finding out what was going on and why my body wasn't healing. And that was kind of when I would say the ball of wool really began to unravel, was through that curiosity and the discoveries that I made during that time that were just really quite fascinating. That really led to insights and healing that I experienced, like profound experiences that I had, and really pretty mystical, like spiritual experiences that were beyond logic and beyond my ability to even articulate what was happening. And I felt very foreign in the group of friends that I was spending time with because everybody just thought I was super weird. And then as I kind of began to share a little bit more openly with other people that were in the yoga space, and other people were not only receptive to what I was sharing, but also sharing experiences that they'd had, I was like, oh, again, that resonance shows up and a settling in my nervous system. And I was like, okay, I think I'm feeling much more at home in this environment and in this practice than in the other. So that transition really began to happen.
We liken it to, well, we were sleeping, and then because of whatever aspect of the practice really resonated with us, it is like an awakening. It's like completely changing the prescription of your glasses. And And I also know that language can cheapen some of the experiences. So only share what you're comfortable with. But you have mentioned that in one of your pilgrimages to India that you had a profound experience. Is that really a memorable, one of the deep spiritual memorable experiences of your life?
Oh my gosh, I have had so many, and there was two really that stand out. One of them was at the very end of traveling. I'd been traveling for about 8 months. I ended up going to this area basically where they provide food and shelter, and you're sleeping in these caves. And it's essentially a retreat center, but it's self-led. And I happened to be the only person there at the time. And I was there for several weeks, and I didn't take anything with me other than my clothes. So I didn't have any distractions. The guy that owned the retreat center would come by in the evening, and he would just kind of yell into my cave, like, Hari Om. And I would say Om, to make sure that I hadn't fallen into the river or anything. And just I think the being on my own and being solo, having the time and the space to actually slow down. And really what I had been craving was this integration of all of my experiences traveling. There was one particular moment where I was sitting on these rocks, just kind of looking out at the landscape, and I just got filled with tears. And I mean, really was just overflowing, because what I was experiencing for the first time ever in my life was feeling like I was a part of something. And it was like, I felt the universe. I'm even like, holy crap, I'm like totally tearing up right now as I recall it, of just feeling the universe moving through me, and that the thing that I had been so driven for so many years, that I was seeking and craving, trying to feel like I was a part of something, it kind of all just dissolved, and I like got it. And that forever changed my life. Another moment was when I had traveled back over to India to study with a teacher that I had studied with before, and I got deathly ill. And I was in hospital for 3 weeks with dengue fever and typhoid. And those listening that aren't familiar with dengue fever, is you can die from it. Can be fatal. I mean, I really thought I was going to die. Like, the dengue fever is what they call breakbone fever. So essentially what happens is the muscles in your bones spasm, and the muscles in your body spasm and start strangling your bones. And it's 11 days long. As with pain, unless you get on top of pain early on, it doesn't matter how much morphine you're given, you can't get on top of the pain. And so it was really very excruciating. And I would say that was for sure a spiritual awakening, in the sense that being able to move through that experience and stay engaged in the experience without disassociating really gave me the gift of, wow, I don't need to seek outside of myself. Like, no one else has the answers, not this teacher, not anyone. Like, I have the answers, and it's all in me.
Wow. I knew from your bio that you had all these major injuries. I had no idea that you experienced that also.
Yeah, that on top of it, and then add on to that a double mastectomy and an oophorectomy that sent me into menopause at 39. I'm like, oh my God.
And thank you so much for being so open about that. I witnessed your decisions and your journey through your sharing on social media, and I so appreciated that truth. And this practice that you're talking about, and the insights that it offered you, how has your practice, your spiritual practice, your yoga, your meditation supported you in the challenges that you faced over the last few years, including that decision to be a pre-viber?
Well, I would say that there's definitely been a felt sense of everything in my life up until a couple of years ago prepared me for what was to come, which was going through the eye of the needle of really navigating the most difficult couple of years of my life, where I mean, talk about being knocked down. because simultaneously I was also navigating a very challenging divorce and sort of coming to grips with, well, wait, the dream that I had is shattered. And in contrast, the surgeries and the pre-Viva experience was actually not as bad in comparison, which is kind of crazy. But yoga, just being able to simply come back to the breath and being really present with moment to moment, how am I feeling and what do I need? That's really where the practice became so sustaining for me throughout that period, and really simple, coming back to the breath, being able to attune to my body and articulate to myself and others in my inner circle, like, this is how I'm feeling, and being able to express that, and this is what I need.
Amy, based on what Katie just said, she actually leads us right into some of her recent Instagram sharings that I know you are also very interested in. Amy has been really open here in our relationship that her journey of healing is from intense burnout. So, Amy, I don't want to speak for you, but Katie, you and I'll let you speak to that more. But Katie recently has been sharing that this life of go, do, strive, and it has had an effect. And you have had to turn even some bigger practices in on yourself in order to create less stress and slow down a little bit. But Amy, I'll let you speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah. My journey has been recovering from burnout and grief, definitely. Can you share with us some of the practices that you use, being such a high achiever, to avoid burnout, or when you find that you're in burnout, how you recognize it and what you do?
Such a good question. Something I'm very passionate about. The first thing was I made a vow and a commitment to myself that I just wasn't going to do it anymore. And I really got underneath what was driving that behavior of go, go, go. And what that entailed was essentially me getting in touch with a part of myself that I literally had never been able to access. And that was the 6-year-old, the 7-year-old little girl that made up a story when my parents divorced that, well, maybe if I'm the best on the athletic team, and maybe if I'm the best in the world as a snowboarder, and maybe if I'm, and that was really what was driving all of that behavior. So I gave myself the opportunity to sit in that and sit really in the grief of what I experienced as a child. And that was the beginning of the shift that has taken place, that has been so unbelievably liberating. And I mean, when I mean sitting in it, like, I sobbed I would notice my tendency, which was to move away from the discomfort of that feeling and of that grief by, oh, I should just check my email. You know what? I'm just going to go jump on the elliptical. Oh, you know what? I really need to call so-and-so. And I just kept saying to myself, no, you're just going to sit on the cushion. You're just going to sit here and you're not going to move. And can you just tip your toe into the feeling? And I sat for quite a while, and then the tears came, and then the tears just kept on coming. I mean, for weeks. I was tending to the part of myself, and really ultimately I began reparenting myself in the way that I needed, that my parents weren't able to do as a kid. And that really set in motion this incredibly powerful shift in the relationship that I have with myself, which is, and I've shared this on social, of like the practice that I've done now for over a year and a quarter or a year and a half is, every day asking myself, how am I feeling? Okay, let me sit with that feeling and feel it fully. What do I need? What am I going to do to support my own needs? And I do that day to day to day, and oftentimes multiple times throughout the day, and really honor what it is that comes up with that. And the push has totally, completely dissipated. And as a result, I would say that I have just such a more expanded sense of peace and genuine happiness. And it's been really, like, really unbelievable. I couldn't have imagined that by doing that practice and the willingness to get in touch with that 7-year-old, which I'd been trying to do my whole life. You know, I'd done a ton of therapy and I could just never get there. It was like when we would do inner child work or whatever, everything would just go numb and I would feel nothing. And it wasn't from lack of a desire, but, one of the beauties of my divorce was that it opened a portal for me to get in touch with that part of myself. And that's really been, I would say, one of the biggest gifts that I've been given.
I found that to be very surprising about burnout when I was working so much and always chasing something. I felt like I was running towards something when in all reality, I was running away from something. And to find out that underneath burnout is almost always grief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, for me, because there's times throughout the year and each quarter when there's stuff that's got to get done, you know what I mean? But for me on the day-to-day, I really shifted, and I actually just did a video on this for one of the participants in my incubator. She was asking, but it's acknowledging first and foremost that the thing that was driving the behavior was wanting acknowledgement, wanting outside acknowledgement that I am enough. And the second thing is I would set myself up to fail from the get-go because I would set these ridiculous to-do lists and action items and goals on a timeline that was literally impossible, so that I would constantly feel myself as not enough. And I really shifted to, okay, I'm making a commitment to be on a stress-free diet. And what does that mean? That means that anytime that I feel my adrenaline kick on and cortisol in my body, I'm going to stop, because nothing is more important than my health. And if I keep going, I'm an adrenaline junkie. So there's a part of me that's addicted to the go, go, go. But that's just not sustainable. And I'd probably give myself a heart attack at 50. So it was, as soon as I noticed the adrenaline kick on, I'm going to stop. And I'm going to either cancel the meeting or push out the deadline, or I'm going to create space so that I can come back to myself and I can come back to what's important in the moment, and just stop. And there's 1,000,001 excuses that would come up to not do that. And I would just keep coming back to it. And it took me about 4 months of doing that moment to moment throughout the day. And really being committed to the practice to actually notice a shift and a change in the way in which I was going about my day-to-day and showing up. Now, I start each day and I give myself just one thing. What's the one thing that I'm going to do today that will, result in me feeling accomplished at the end of the day? And one thing is enough.
That's powerful. I'm writing that down. What's coming up for me as I'm listening to this conversation is how we're so much more alike as human beings and as women than we are separate. And you're sharing so much about your life that was for acceptance, was for that seeking for unconditional love. And for you, it showed up with performance and perfectionism. And for Amy, that showed up in working herself to the ground. And for me, it showed up in obsessively worrying so much about what others thought that it drove me into like life-altering panic attacks until I had this disorder that made my life so small that I couldn't even drive my car. But what's the one thing we have all in common is that we all just wanted to be truly seen. And we were all looking for that from the external. And that's what we all do. That is a major source of our core suffering. And by the sharing of our stories as people and as women, as we once would do in circles, and as we do more often in circles, it's so powerful. We learn from one another and we see ourselves in one another. And so I'm feeling really touched and moved in this moment that you're sharing with us so honestly. And this is medicine, being open in this way.
Wow. Well, I so appreciate that, and it's such an honor. And in the craving to be seen, one of the things that I did this year that I think for me it was incredibly powerful, and it sounds so simple. And on this notion of being seen was I did this like 24-hour intensive with a therapist. And part of what she requested/required for me to do was go in to the bathroom, and she was like, I want you to see yourself. I want you to really see yourself, because you're not seeing yourself the way that other people see yourself. This is why I'm like so hard on myself, And I was like, okay, well, like how hard could that be? And so I go in, and then like I walk out. I like look at myself and I'm like, oh my gosh, you look really old. And then like I leave. And then a couple of hours, like an hour later or something, I'm like, okay, I'm going to try this again. And I like go back in, and I'm like, again, the judgy, critical Katie is like talking, and I'm just like, this is stupid. Like this is dumb. And then finally I go in and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I just sat and I just breathed and I just looked, and I, not prompted by her, but just by myself, I went back to my earliest memory that I ever had. And I saw myself as that little girl. And then I just kind of went through the timeline of my life, of all the things that I've experienced, that, the highs and the lows. And I mean, I was probably in there for about 3 hours. And I was just sobbing and watching myself sob. And really, at the end, it was just like, can I swear in here? Holy shit, woman. You have been through some shit. Oh my goodness. And it was really, really, really moving. And there was a lot of like forgiveness towards myself that came up, and forgiveness for how self-critical I had been throughout my whole life of myself and my always performance-based criticism. What was interesting after that experience was the critic totally neutralized. Like it wasn't until about 3 weeks later, I was sitting on my couch having a conversation with a girlfriend of mine, and I was like, I really just haven't noticed the critic. As I thought more about it, it was like when, for instance, say I'm putting on clothes to go out, and the critic before would be like, oh my gosh, you shouldn't wear that. You look terrible in those jeans. Like you really need to work out, da 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 da. The thought would be like, I don't feel great in these jeans. Like I don't feel sexy. I'm going to try something else on. And I would try something else on, and it would be like, yeah, this feels good. Like that was, the conversation had completely changed, and that negativity and self-deprecation had just vanished. And that has been, this was like maybe 6 months ago, so it wasn't even that long ago. But wow, what a liberating experience. And again, the key was the willingness to sit in the discomfort of all of the feelings that arose when I was really seeing myself.
So a part of me really wants to do that, and a part of me is really resistant to do that.
Oh, let me tell you, the resistance was real.
Well, and we can only take others as far as we've gone. So we appreciate, and I know that your clients and students appreciate where you're willing to take yourself. You've taken yourself into public radical truth telling. I want to circle people back to that TEDx talk. Definitely search Katie Brauer and watch that. I was so inspired. I have a big truth that I've been wanting to tell, and it's inspiring me to do that in one of my relationships. And then speaking of the work that you do and how you do hold space for others, share with us what you have going on, how you support others, and how people can find you if they want to work with you.
Sure, they can. People can find me on my website, which is just katiebrower.com. I work with a lot of yoga teachers and have a yoga program, online program, the Yoga Professional Incubator that supports teachers in really giving them everything that they need to create a sustainable business, as well as training certification programs and all of that good stuff that I do live. And for the sort of general quote unquote public, particularly women, I work with in an online program called Flourish, which is really this introduction of mindfulness and a radical self-acceptance, and really giving the tools for skillful living, and the pieces that have really shifted and changed and contributed to my life. Those are the things that I share with others in that program. And then I usually always will have like in-person retreats happening once or twice a year, and you can catch me in a yoga class if you're ever in Solana Beach, California. I teach a couple times a week.
Well, you know what? I'm going to be there next week.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm going to be in San Diego for the rest of the month, so I am going to look you up and come in and see you. And because I've accepted my inner teenager, I will be able to just meet you feet on the floor with authentic vulnerability and courage, rather than any sort of fear of not measuring up.
Amazing! I can't wait.
Thank you for listening to the Radiant Warrior podcast. If you found it valuable, please leave us a positive review to help others find it.
And please check out the Radiant Warrior podcast on Instagram and Facebook to leave us your questions and find out where you can come and practice with us next.